Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CoLab, SpacetoCo's free monthly online sessions designed to assist those working in community venues to learn, upskill, and be inspired to do their work more effectively and efficiently. We hope that you can find these sessions useful for the important work you do in our local communities. For those of you who are watching this recording after this live event, hello, and we hope you get valuable knowledge from this session. My name is Carmela, and I organize these monthly learning series. Just a little bit about SpacetoCo before we move on. Our mission in SpacetoCo is to help community venues be a thriving hub in their communities. We do so by providing opportunities to be able to grow bookings, increase community engagement, as well as support. We also create and provide free resources for those working in community venues. SpacetoCo is a two-sided marketplace where you can list your spaces where guests can find and book them online. It is also an effective and efficient booking system tool where you can reduce your admin by 80%. We work with a number of local governments as well as community centers across Australia and New Zealand. For this month's collab session, we will be hearing from our very own SpacetoCo New Zealand Director, Elle Bell. She is no stranger to these sessions and have ran multiple ones in the past. She will be giving us a jam-packed session on how much to charge for your venue hire, with data that we've collected over the years with working with community venues themselves. She will also be sharing the ultimate guide on how much to charge for your venue hire. I would love to introduce Elle. So Elle has worked with hundreds of local community venues to help them move to online bookings, create better processes, and provide useful guidance on how to market and grow the impact of the spaces for the local community. She's also my boss and the best boss ever. And she has so much knowledge and passion to share with you guys about how she wants to keep growing communities and let them thrive and be a great and awesome hub for the community. So, on to you, Elle.
Thanks, Arms. It's a lovely introduction. And thank you very much to everyone who's joined us today. So we had over 86 registered, and often because of different time zones, a lot of people will watch this from recording as well. So if you're not on the chat live watching with us now, hello to everyone in the recording, and I really hope that this is useful. This is a topic that I have been wanting to talk about and prepare some data analysis for a few years now, because I'm aware that we have this really amazing data set from the 3,000 plus spaces that we have on our platform that could really help the venues from across Australia and New Zealand understand how their pricing relates to how other venues price, and give some interesting benchmarking data if we're looking to understand how much to price your hall or your meeting room at, depending on different variables. So as Carm said, there's kind of three parts to this. The first is the basic elements of pricing. And for those of you who are already SpacetoCo venues who we work with, this will probably be quite familiar with you, because it's how we advise all of the venues that use our booking platform to structure their pricing. So this will be a bit of a refresher, but it's also an important way to think about pricing, and the way that we've structured those elements of pricing is also how we structured the benchmarking data. So it's an important foundation of understanding how we've done the data analysis, and should hopefully give you some good tips on the best ways to construct a rate card. The second part of the presentation is presenting back the data analysis we've done, which has benchmark data on hourly pricing across different types of venues, and some of our insights from that. And then lastly, we've got some tips on how you could use our data to inform your pricing. So hopefully that will be an interesting and useful session. And then just a quick note before I start on just the philosophy of pricing. For those of you that recognize this is a piece of art called The Rabbit by Jeff Koons. And it is the most expensive piece of art sold by a living artist. If you can believe it, this rabbit, which is made of stainless steel, the same as a kitchen knife, sold at auction for $91 million US, right? And I think the moral behind this story is that there's always an objective element of pricing and a subjective element of pricing. Pricing is a lot about the value with which someone sees something and their subjective value of what they're willing to pay for something. So most of this presentation is really about objectively how much do other venues charge. So hopefully that should give you one end of the spectrum. But with any pricing, there's always who are you trying to attract and what do you think they will pay? What do you think your services are worth? So just as a sort of thing to think about as you think about your own pricing is thinking about objectivity and subjectivity about what the value of something really is. And it still blows my mind that $91 million for that piece of art is what someone thought it was worth. So it's just interesting about how as humans we value different things. So starting off with the basic elements of pricing, and we recommend that you think about pricing in as 4 basic elements. And I've given an example here, and I'll just talk you through them briefly here, and then we'll do a deep dive on them. The first is, and the most foundational part, is a basic hourly rate. And so this is basically the unit with which you build all pricing from. This is the basic price per hour of your venue. And just to be clear, within a venue, you will have the venue itself, and then you might have spaces within it. So each price should have a basic hourly rate, and then you might have another basic hourly rate for the whole venue itself. So it should be an hourly rate for the space that's being hired out. The second element of pricing is variable pricing. And this is rates that differ from the standard rate depending on usually the user, the usage, or the time of day. So typically this might be casual versus regular hirers. It might be peak versus off-peak pricing, or it might be commercial versus community rates. And these should also be standardized as well, so that they're really, really clear as to how they differ from the basic hourly rate. The third element of pricing is all the additional extras and charges that also build to what goes on the customer's end bill, but are not necessarily tied to the hireage of the space. So these are things like equipment hire, staff fees, cleaning fees, furniture hire, etc. And all of these grow to sort of create that quotation or that final price for the customer. And then lastly, we have discounting. And I think it's important to recognize that discounting is different to variable pricing. Variable pricing is standard, whereas discounting is usually a one-off discount that's applied to a particular user for a specific promotion, and is something that is cheaper than the public displayed rates. And I think you should account for it slightly differently as well, which we'll get into. So just diving into basic hourly rate and why we believe that it's really the fundamental unit of pricing. Basically, it is the only thing that really has relativity, as in you can compare it with other venues, and it's useful because you can use it to build more complex pricing. Pretty much anything else is not as comparable and not as easy to build from. So just to give some examples of what we see other venues using and why we would recommend that you use a basic hourly rate, is so things like day rates, they're not comparable between venues. So one venue's day rate might be for 8 hours, another venue's day rate might be for 12 hours. And when they're divisible, it doesn't come up with the same equivalent rate. Attendee rates, so some venues charge per attendees, and this is a really frustrating journey for the hirer because they often won't know how many attendees they have until the day. They might have to overcount, it might cost them more, and they can't adequately account for their costs until the last minute. Day delegate rates are problematic because they're actually bundling venue hire and services. So again, we can't accurately compare the venue hire itself. And then we know that some venues also use things like term rates, so a rate to use a space over a course of a term. But this may be very favourable to the hirer, but the venue might be losing out because there's no incentive for hirers to let you know when they don't use the space, and they often will just block the space and not actually use it for all the time because there's no incentive for them to not use it. So even if you never intend to charge just for an hour of venue hire, even if you always intend to charge for a minimum hire of 3 hours or 4 hours or a day, you should always start with what is the basic hourly price, because that's what gives the comparison point, and that's what you'll be able to use in this benchmarking. The second element is variable pricing, and I'll just dive into a few examples of how venues use variable pricing. The most fundamental is the difference between a casual hire and regular hire. And casual hire is typically where someone books as a one-off and they pay up front. So kids' birthday party is probably one of the most prevalent with the venues that we work with. It could be for other types of celebration. It could be for an AGM. It could be for a community meeting. And they typically book maybe once, twice, 3 times a year, or might do a block of 3 or 4. But importantly, they usually pay up front for that, and that's casual hire. And that's usually your basic standard hourly rate. Regular hire is your VIPs. So these are the groups that are coming in and out of your venue week on week, month on month, and they typically spend a fair amount with the venue over the course of a year. So therefore, as a reward for loyalty and continually running activities in your venue, they typically have a lower rate, so a regular hire rate. But across both casual and regular hire, you still might have different tiers of pricing depending on who is using the space. So, for example, a lot of venues differentiate between community users, commercial users, and non-for-profit users, so that they have variable pricing depending on what the hire is maybe able to pay. So you'd expect that a commercial business user might be able to afford to pay more than a community user. But one kind of thing to think about or be really careful with tiers of pricing is, as a venue, getting super clear on the criteria for how you know as a hirer which of these tiers you are eligible for. So to give an example, a community dance class is both a commercial business because they are charging for people to attend and possibly making a profit from hiring out your venue and charging people to attend a regular dance class. However, it's also a community organisation because it's providing a point of connection, a community dance class every week. So you will need to think about how you determine the difference between some of these types of groups that might blur the lines between commercial and community. So, for example, you might define commercial as a private business meeting that's not open to the public. So, for example, say Fonterra wants to book out your hall for a meeting with local farmers. That's not necessarily open to the public or open to the community, whereas someone that's running paid chess classes is open to all the kids in the community, and that might be the difference between those two rates. So just one to think about as you're defining your rates. The third element of pricing is that sometimes venues will have different pricing depending on peak or off-peak times to manage supply and demand. So to make lower demand times more attractive and charge a premium for the higher demand times. Seasonal is also another reason why people might charge more, or venues might charge more. So, for example, if costs are different to the venue in different seasons, so if heating or lighting are higher in winter, they might charge a higher rate in winter rather than as opposed to summer. And then lastly, we also see variable rates based on the type of usage. So in particular, weddings and functions tend to attract premium pricing and are charged out differently because they have possibly a different level of risk, a different level of service that comes with them. Equally, they might be priced more affordably for something like a kid's birthday party if that's the type of thing you'd like to attract into your venue. Items and charges. So these are things that are charged in addition to the venue hire. And many venues do use a selection of different things that they charge in addition to the basic room hire. So this might be stuff like equipment hire, like tables and chairs, morning tea, parking. And typically there are 3 ways that venues charge for these things. And you should, as you're, again, building your rate card, think about which is most appropriate for your venue and for the items that you're charging. But as an example, Venues will charge something like piano hire out as a per booking, so you pay one price per booking, whereas something like tea and coffee might be charged per person, so you might have to buy a tea and coffee kind of voucher for the 10 people that are attending. And then other things tend to be charged out per hour, and these tend to be things that do have an hourly cost associated with them. So, for example, if you have to have security or staffing, then that might be charged out per hour. Next up is discounts. And I firmly believe that discounts should be considered quite separately to regular, those variable regular pricing rates. Variable pricing is something that, although is variable, is still standard, whereas discounts might not necessarily be standards, and they can change with the user group, with the time of year, with the thing that you're trying to do. Discounts is where you are giving a discount from the standard price, and that might be a discount from the casual price or the regular hire price for a specific reason. So it might be a staff discount, it might be to honour a historic pricing rate, but most importantly, it's really important to track discounts, because through discounting, especially as a community venue or a council venue, you're actually investing in the community by giving that discount to that community group. So you should be firstly transparent with the fact that you are giving a discount from the agreed price, because that's what the venue has been priced at, that's the public view, so that people understand that you are giving them something of value. And secondly, if you track what value you are giving away or investing in community, you can use that in things like your annual reporting. It can be a point of pride to say we have gifted $1,000 in venue hire to these specific groups because we wanted to help them get off the ground. But it helps you quantify that value that you're discounting. And on SpacetoCo, when you set up your discount codes, you can actually report the value that's been redeemed against discount codes, so that you can very easily see in this tiny screenshot exactly how much value you have discounted on your venue hire and therefore invested in community. And just lastly, I thought this was really interesting when I did the data analysis. 20% of spaces on SpacetoCo have a $0 basic hourly rate. And we do love free spaces because they are just a great way to support the community to get into affordable local spaces. And there's lots of different reasons why venues may choose to actually not charge for their venue. It may be to support community usage of local spaces. Many venues actually have a free space alongside their paid spaces as kind of a gateway option, where groups might start using the free space and then eventually, when they're big enough, move to the paid space. So a community lounge is a typical option for this, or maybe a courtyard. They may decide that the space is basically free, but certain groups might pay. So, for example, it's free for community, but commercial pays. And there are other spaces that are just used for viewing, inspection, or not a space. So we have lots of venues sharing other things like busking spaces and market stall, which may not be charged or revenue creating, but equally they want to share them with the community. And if I was to boil down like the elements of pricing and your pricing strategy into 2 words, just make sure that you're transparent and that it's simple. Venues can make pricing overly complex. If you can't fit it on one page, it's probably too complex, because it creates a bump for when someone is looking at your venue. So the 2 biggest things that will put people off when they're looking at your website to understand if they're, if that venue is right for their usage is, firstly, if they can't see pricing, and if it's like price on request, a lot of people won't actually make that extra step to find out how much your venue costs, because they might be shy about whether or not they can afford it, and they don't want to be sort of rejected by finding out it's too high. And then secondly, if they can't understand the pricing, so for example, if they think they're in a different tier and then it turns out they're not, then their expectations haven't been managed and they might drop out of the hiring process. So keep it simple and keep it very transparent. So that brings us on to the real meat of the presentation, which is, what do other venues charge? And this is basically the benchmarking exercise that we've done across all of the 3,000 plus spaces on our SpacetoCo platform. And just a quick kind of overview of the data and a bit of a disclaimer about the data, just so you know how to use this data when we share it with you. Firstly, we've had to manually categorize all of those spaces into these different categories. And there's always room for subjectivity when you're categorizing things. So sometimes it's difficult to tell whether a space should be considered a meeting room or a hall, depending on its size and capacity. And secondly, within those categorizations, because of the nature of SpacetoCo mainly being a platform for affordable community venues, there are some categories that we have heaps and heaps and heaps of data that we can pull from, and others that are less common. But we've tried to be transparent in the benchmarking where the sample size of the data was low, to give you an indication of how much you can trust that price point. Secondly, we chose to use the mean rather than the median to calculate the average pricing, because the distribution of the data was reasonably normal. But that does also change what the average pricing is. And then lastly, the pricing shown in this benchmarking is in Australian dollars, where the original rate was NZD. We used a conversion which was accurate as of last week. Just so you're aware. So if you're looking at this from a New Zealand perspective, you can always apply that conversion rate back from these rates, if that's helpful to you. So the first type of benchmarking we did was we just took the type of space and then we benchmarked them across the different types of locations, because we know that location does make a difference as to how desirable a venue is. And we grouped location in 3 ways. So firstly, CBD, and what we mean by this is in a city where Google Maps says the central business district is, and in a town, if it's on the main commercial road or couple of roads in the town centre, we've called that the CBD. Suburban is basically any suburb that's not the CBD in a city or the rest of a town. And then rural is where it's in a village. And you can see from the pink on this that the vast majority of our data comes from suburban venues. So we're reasonably confident with the suburban ones, but there is a lower data set for the ones in the CBD. And that's also just due to the nature of the types of spaces as well. However, our hypothesis around does location make a difference to price was backed up. So what we can see is that on average, CBD charges almost double a rural location, and then about 20% higher than a suburban location. Hospitality spaces, which is things like pubs, bars, wedding venues, are consistently higher because they provide a high level of service. And interestingly, parks show the lowest level of kind of differentiation between the CBD, suburban and rural. So that just gives you a high level view of the difference between spaces and their location and how much they charge. And the next set of pricing variables we looked at was capacity. And as you'd expect, the larger the space in general, the higher the price, the higher the hourly price. However, there was one slight interesting data point, which is that at the 51 to 100 capacity mark, there's a slight increase in the data. There's a slight increase in the pricing. So I think that could either be tied to the fact that that is the sort of most popular size of venues, but also might be where there's the highest demand for a venue of sort of 50 to 100, especially when you think about community usage and larger groups using spaces. There's much less consistency in the data above 100, just because the variability in the data is higher. So it's much harder to make comparisons at the larger capacities. But I think we can be reasonably confident with those smaller capacity brackets. And next up is type of space and the type of venue that's hiring out the space. So we've grouped it by business, so commercial enterprise, community, so for example, a community centre, a sports trust, a charitable trust, then council government, and then private. So that's someone that might be hiring out as an individual, or a domestic space. And on average, commercial business properties are 3 times higher rates than council and government. And then we see that's 1.7 times higher than community. And that community venues are actually 1.8 times higher than council government, which was an interesting finding. It's interesting to note that the lower sample sizes correlate with the type of host. So, for example, we wouldn't necessarily expect to find a large amount of cafe spaces operated by council, government and community, whereas hall and meeting room would be fairly typical for those types of hosts. And then we've just done a bit of a deep dive on the most popular types of spaces, so that if you're looking at benchmarking your pricing, the most likely types of spaces that you would have in your venue tend to be halls and meeting rooms. So we've just taken the data specifically for halls and benchmarked that type of space. So across the different locations, so the first benchmarking is across location, and then by category, by capacity, you can see that there is a bit of a correlation between, again, the location type, CBD being slightly more expensive, and then the higher the capacity, the higher the pricing. So if you're looking to kind of pinpoint what bracket your venue should be in, probably for a hall, this is maybe the most useful table to look at. Then we went on to benchmark actually the difference between casual and regular high rates between suburban and rural halls, and give a bit of a guidance on ratio of how much venues charge between their casual basic hourly rate and then what they charge their regular community hire. And this is a ratio of basically saying that if your normal casual rate is $100, typically the regular community rate is about $60. So it's a 60% ratio compared to the casual pricing. Doesn't tend to be much of a discount for commercial hire, and then not-for-profit is 50% and government is 50% as well. So if you're looking to sort of start or create your rate card, this is a really useful place to start in terms of like what typically hall spaces charge differently between their casual upfront costs and their regular hire. There wasn't masses of variation regionally, and of course this is looking at all halls, but it's just an interesting data point as well to take into consideration. And then we also looked at some different points of comparison across how halls hire out their spaces. So 70% of halls do actually have a regular pricing rate card, which is pretty expected because we know that typically they would have high community usage. And a third of halls actually have a day rate. So this is where the pricing is capped at a duration, and that typically is 8 hours, was the most common one that halls tend to use. So this is where the day rate is 8 times the casual rate, and then any other further usage is just included as part of that day rate. 68% of halls have a minimum booking duration of 1 hour. A lot of halls or venues, when they're thinking about what their booking policies might be, try and work out what's the kind of minimum booking time versus reward for them in terms of, how much effort is it to manage that booking based on how long they'll be using the hall for. So I was interested to see that about 70% are happy to rent out a hall for an hour. 18% have 1 to 3 hours, and then only 3% of halls ask for a minimum booking of more than 3 hours, which I think shows that most venues are looking to maximise utilisation rather than the length of booking. And then I don't know whether you can see this behind my picture, but essentially the next data point is just that the most common cancellation period across all the halls is 1 to 2 weeks, and it's a fairly even split between that. So the cancellation period is the time up to which you can cancel without penalty. And yeah, 1 to 2 weeks is the norm. The next deep dive is meeting rooms. And so again, you can see the benchmarking between this time rural and suburban. and the different capacities. Again, we see a fairly expected, like the higher the capacity, the more expensive the price. Aside from the higher, when you get to after 50 plus, there's so few meeting rooms that we would consider meeting rooms as to be that capacity that the data has a very, very low sample size. It's a very, very similar ratio of regular pricing to casual pricing between community halls and meeting rooms, so nothing really unexpected there. And again, not huge amounts of variation. Western Australia and New South Wales being the highest average prices across the regions that we work with. Far less meeting rooms have regular pricing, so that's 48%, which shows possibly that more casual use is expected in these type of spaces. And only 28% have a day rate, and typically this is 6 to 7 times the basic hourly rate rather than 8 for halls. 72% have a minimum booking duration of an hour, again, more likely in this type of meeting space. And similarly to halls, the most common cancellation policy is 1 to 2 weeks, but actually 20% have a 24-hour or lower cancellation policy, probably reflecting a more higher frequency of these uses. We did also look at doing a parks deep dive. There is a lot less data and it's much harder to draw conclusions for parks. We work with many, many councils, but there's a huge variety in what is considered to be a park space. I think the most interesting data point for parks was that actually the lower capacity was typically higher priced, which I think is to do with things like gazebos and patios and barbecues actually being in higher demand than some of the maybe larger park spaces. And again, we saw that most of the parks have a minimum booking duration of an hour. And then we just did a comparison of the different regular versus casual rates across all of the different types. And again, came up with a very similar ratio to those other halls and meeting rooms, which is that idea that a regular community rate tends to be somewhere between 60 and 70% at the casual rate, and then it's slightly less for non-for-profit and government. We also looked at items and charges. This is much harder to get accurate benchmarking, partly because our data set isn't mature enough to really understand the difference between someone hiring out 10 tables and chairs or 100 tables and chairs. So I definitely would take this data with a pinch of salt and use it as a very, very broad brush guide. But it is interesting to see the sort of rough pricing, either per booking or per hour across these different types of things that are charged out. And it might also give you a view of just the types of things that venues do charge out in addition to their basic venue hire, which is another thing to think about, especially if you're starting out with pricing and what you should charge for. Our advice on this is typically items and charges come with a much more definable cost of goods and service. So for example, if it is tea and coffee or if it is a staff charge, understand what it is costing you and then what premium you need to add to be profitable or to create revenue from that item is probably where we'd recommend you start. But I do think this is also an interesting look at how you should charge for items in different categories. So for example, the vast majority of items and charges will have a fixed price per booking, that is the light pink, whereas only a couple of them tend to be more per hour, and unsurprisingly that is staff charges, because there's a very clear salary equivalent to the staff person that's being called out to be part of that booking. Yeah, so typically surcharges is where you're charging, for example, an hourly surcharge for a function price. And then The very last part of today's collab is just a few examples of how you can use this guide, and we are going to send this out, so you'll have this data to kind of compare back to. If you're just starting out and you want to understand, okay, what should I charge for my venue, you can basically use this data to find the average and then work out how far away from the average your venue should be. So as an example, in our data, we can see a suburban hall with 100 to 200 capacity is about $60 an hour. So you put that in as 100%. If your offering is lower in terms of quality and amenities and the types of hirers, so if they have a need for low budget, you might consider pricing somewhere in this lower range. Or if your service offering or type of hire has more money to spend, you might put it more here, but this gives you a point to start from. The second way you can use not just this data, but also SpacetoCo, is that all of this data comes from what's already on our public marketplace. So if you use our marketplace to go and have a look at a typical area that's like your area, and then filter down by capacity, you'll actually be able to see very clearly what other venues like yours are charging, and then use that as a way to say, how do we distinguish ourselves? What should our pricing be as relative to what else is in the market? And you can also dive into further details on how they price for things like function hire, etc. We always recommend that you think about creating a very well-defined regular hire rate card. Again, because we have these ratios from the data that we've collated, if you know what your casual hire is, you can apply the ratios that we've calculated as being the average to create your regular hire rate card. So for example, if your casual hire rate is $50 an hour, you can then apply these ratios to come up with your basic regular hire. And that should give you a starting point for doing that. And if you already have regular hirers, but you don't necessarily have a standardized rate card, we really recommend that you do this. A lot of venues end up in a situation where they might have 30 regular hirers that are all on different historic rates, even for the same spaces, because they've been agreed years ago and never changed. And this isn't necessarily a problem in terms of you can honour that rate, but it can cause complications. So it can set a standard discounting that means it sets a standard that others may try and negotiate down, when actually you have a much higher cost to operate the venue than when those original prices were negotiated, and it reduces the perceived value of what you're offering your hirers. And then secondly, you're essentially creating 30 different bespoke invoicing and transactional agreements that you have to honour each month, which causes more admin for the team, and a lot more admin when things go wrong. So for example, in COVID times, when regular hirers had to have lots and lots of different credit notes or discounts or refunds done, each of those had to be done in a specific way because of how they were charged differently. So even if you don't intend to increase or change your regular hire pricing, at least document the difference that your current regular hirers are from your standardized rate card, so that you can communicate the value that you are actually giving them. So if, for example, your standard community rate is $50 an hour, but they've been paying $25 an hour, the invoice should say $50 an hour, but with a 50% discount, so that they understand that they are receiving a discounted rate. So if you ever do need to increase pricing to keep up with cost of living, you can show the difference and the value that they've received over the years in terms of standardizing the rates. And so that's the presentation. Hopefully that's been helpful. It's been a bit of a whirlwind in terms of the data we've shared, but we will send it out to everyone so that you can use it and have a look with your teams. I didn't know whether there are any questions that came up in the chat.
Yeah, we have one. Sorry for everybody who's watching. This is actually our first time using Wistia, so we're kind of like playing around with things. And this is awesome. There's one Q&A that is actually on the stage. I don't know if you can see it, Elle, but someone's asked, what's the most interesting or surprising thing you have found from the deep dive of pricing?
That's a good question. I was when I first crunched the data, I was really hoping that there would be patterns, because I didn't know whether this is the first time we've done this exercise, whether you could see that there was a clear distinction between sort of like, oh, it goes up in capacity or it changes across the different locations or what you'd expect. But actually, there are patterns, and I think that does show that there is, a good. We can be reasonably confident in the data, to know that the average haul price is say $60 for 100 to 150 people. So I was surprised that particularly that we actually did find such strong correlations. Yeah, I think that was the main thing that it's not surprising, but I was hoping for, which we found.
Awesome. We have another one from Claire from the town of Cambridge. I'll pop it up now. So she's asking, will there be any guides on how to set fees and charges noting the booking fee?
So I think if you're if you have a booking fee on top of the venue hire, that's there's the booking. So if you're talking about the booking fee on SpacetoCo, which is the non-refundable booking fee, that's I think fairly well communicated throughout the booking journey. If you're talking about a booking administration fee, that would be a different item and charge that's charged in addition to the venue hire fee. So it's really clearly differentiated. But Claire, if there's any more help we can give you on that in particular, happy to catch up later in terms of how to communicate that.
Awesome. We have another one. So as per standardizing regular prices, what else do you recommend in terms of communicating pricing to customers, especially if prices are a bit complex?
I think firstly that the more you can do to remove complexity of pricing, the better. So often, I know when we first start working with, let's say, a larger community organisation or a venue, and we take a look at their fees and charges. Fees and charges seem to have built up over time. And when you start to interrogate all of the different modes of charging, there's usually ways that you can simplify it without compromising revenue. The kind of paradox of it is that if you simplify pricing, you'll probably increase your revenue because you've got less bumps in the customer journey in terms of understanding how much it will cost. So yeah, the more you can simplify, the better. What else can you do to communicate pricing to customers? I think have it be very, very transparent on your website. On SpacetoCo, we communicate pricing in a very simple and specific way so that it is comparable. Yeah, I think that would be the main one to communicate pricing. Just make it really, really clear and transparent and easy. If you put yourself in the shoes of a customer or a hirer and go through the booking journey, at what point could they question the pricing? At what point might it not be clear? And that might be a way to see opportunities to better communicate pricing.
Awesome. Sweet. If there are no other questions that anybody has, we'll move on. But also, I know that Elle's actually mentioned a lot of things regarding SpacetoCo. If there are any other questions that you have regarding that, feel free to reach out to us, because we do have some of our business managers here that can answer some of the questions. But you can also connect with us by booking a demo or just chatting to us about how you guys can also access some of these things. Oh, Ian Smith also asked a question. So this one says, do you have data on how many hours rural halls are hired out over a yearly period?
Hi, Ian, firstly. Yes, I think we do, but I don't have it compiled here. My first answer is, from what I know, is it really varies. I mean, rural halls typically have a lower occupancy and utilisation than, say, a suburban hall. But I wouldn't know off the top of my head what that is. But definitely, I could take a look at that data point across maybe a sample size of halls and see what it comes out as again, maybe a future benchmarking collab we could do on utilization rather than pricing. That's definitely something we should look at.
Awesome. Sweet. That was jam-packed, Elle.
That was quite dense in terms of a presentation. So well done everyone who stuck with it. That was probably our most data-heavy presentation I think we've done.
I know.
But I really hope there's value in it. The question, how much should I charge, or am I charging too much or too little, comes up in every single one of our onboarding conversations with the venues we work with, and in a lot of our sales discussions as well. So yeah, the definitive guide should give you, and I don't think there's anything else out there like this that really shows what other venues are charging in that affordable community space. So I'm hoping that it will be useful.
Yeah. No, it was really information heavy, but it was good. And for those of you who don't know, we will be sending the PowerPoint, all the resource Elle has mentioned, and the pricing guide that she's created. Yeah, we will be sending it to everybody after the session along with the recording, because we know that there's so much of you guys that are like, wait, we're going through so much, but I can't read everything at one point and I want to retain all the information. So fear not. We also have, as Shauna has mentioned on the chat, we do have access to all the recordings of our previous collab sessions that we will link to you guys in our emails. And with that, we just wanted to thank Elle again for leading us into such a great and informative session. Definitely very handy and very practical for everybody who works in community venues. And hopefully you guys can tune in with us in the next collab session next month, happening on Tuesday, the 28th of May. It will be about community advocacy, which is awesome. So it's about how community venues can advocate for themselves and guide other communities to advocate for other venues as well. And so we hope that you guys can tune into that session as well. And we hope you also have a great day today. Look at that. Yeah, just have 10 minutes to go with the rest of your day. But thank you again for tuning in with us, and we hope you have a great week. Yeah.